Anguachlas.
Anguatlas, Nuguam, Omegilis, Gayotlan Laha, Wallace Quagu, the Gomoksa. Mary Everson, assigned to the Comox band by the government. But I have a heritage that is from the Wallace Quagu in Fort Rupert and also here through my father.
Can you tell me about your parents?
My parents, my mom was Margaret Frank and my father was Andy Frank. They raised me here on the reserve and I'm just so thrilled that they did what they did. They gave me a firm foundation to my life. And because my father was a fisherman, he was away most of the time during the summer and into the fall, and then again in this early spring for herring. And so I spent a lot of time with my mother, who would only speak Kwakwala to me up until her death in 1997. And so it was really important that they gave me that base and understanding of who I was and how I fit into the scheme of things in the world today, and with the different things that had happened to them. My mother never went to school. My father went to school for, I think it was 3 years at residential school, and so I had a real firm foundation in our culture because they recognized the need to preserve it.
What is your earliest memory of what it was like not being allowed to practice your culture?
I was probably told when very young, but the government had a double standard in it, in that when I was 3, the government asked my father to meet a dignitary at the airport, and we were all wearing our regalia. Our regalia hadn't been confiscated, and it was kept quite secure in trunks and different things. And so when I was very young, I was 3, my first recollection of being in a blanket and meeting who knows who, you know, at the airport. But we have a picture of that with Jim King also, and that was my first recollection, and not really understanding that there was any ban because we're dressed in our regalia. And so it wasn't until later when my father started opening up, well, I think when they announced that we could dance again, and I'm going, well, we always have. So I was very fortunate to have parents who really wanted to preserve and to hang on to the culture and traditions of our peoples. And it was very important in those days because not very many people did. They had totally let it go. And they're the ones that are searching today for who they are.
So how has the Potlatch Band impacted you personally, your family, and your community?
That's a big question. It affected so many people. We're in a real unusual situation for a reserve here in Canada, where we've got 2 towns, Courtenay and Comox, and we're right in the middle, right between them. And the influence of assimilation is so powerful in those days that I can remember people not realizing this was a reserve. It was houses just like everywhere else, and I can remember some of the negative parts of it, being told, you know, that you are a dirty Indian or you're a squaw. But I fixed that the res way, you know. And I remember that, and my dad said, you know who you are. We have always taught you who you are. So it really didn't affect me as much as seeing other people going through a diversion from the and of the culture and traditions of our peoples. Many people got into a lot of self-medicating things like, especially alcohol. Alcohol was a big thing here on our reserve, and that had other ramifications. And alcohol is a medication for trauma. It's one of the many things that have happened, and I think that separation from your culture and your traditions really affected a lot of the kids in the different reserves that I've watched or seen or in my lifetime.
What does reconciliation mean to you?
I think it's got to come from heart, and it's got to come from understanding and knowledge. Knowledge is one of the biggest things that you need to recognize, listen, and you need to digest a lot of the negative and positive things that happened in our lives. And I think that it develops into how we react to it, the fairness of it, the equal rights that we have, and yet understanding that we are very unique peoples, because this is our homeland, this is where we're from. We can trace back our ancestry through our songs and our dances and through our family namima in my case. And those are really important things. Those are the things that give you a validation of your existence. And I really feel that it's important for us to pass it on to our children. And I think that I've accomplished that in many ways. There's still lots of things I need to do. So, it's important for the next generations to understand who we are as First Nations people and our rights that we have, whether it's in the community or in the country, but most definitely it begins in the family. And the family core has to be strong, and it has to be understanding of who they are and understanding the old Indian laws. I remember my mom saying, you go into the big house, white man's laws don't affect you in the big house. There's no democracy in the big house. It is already ordained by the Creator and by our peoples for many, many centuries, and those things have to be adhered to. So I think that a lot of our people have forgotten. There's two sides. There's the governmental side, and there's also the cultural side of life for us as First Nations people. And it saddens me that a lot of our people haven't practiced it, or have all of a sudden had an enlightenment that who they are, or what the potential of what they are, and they grasp at things that might not be their right. Well, the people who were raised to know in the culture know who is who and how it worked, because my mom really instilled it in me, how we acted in the big house, how we reacted to other people, how we cared for other people, how we loved and honored and respect our elders around us. And that was acknowledging our ancestral connections, not just today. So when we talk about history and the ban, behind closed doors, it was going on in relationships and in knowledge being passed on to different generations. And I think that the trauma that happened to our people many, many years ago is the basis of what happened in our own people not having that spark to carry on with our culture and traditions, and the involvement of things that were so foreign to us, like alcohol, today drugs. self-medication. And I look at it in a different way than most people. They kind of look at me and say, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "When you lose family members through results of using those things, you start to think about it, not as just a tragedy, but a series of tragedy." I probably got off the subject.
How do you feel that non-Indigenous people can support in cultural revival and healing?
The old adage of our old people is sit down and listen. Listen and have an open mind in understanding how things evolved over the years. And I see the same thing reoccurring in the States today on their non-inclusiveness of peoples. And we were already here, but we were pushed aside. And I think that a lot of our people don't realize how that impacts us today, because it's very intergenerational. I never went to residential school, but I didn't start school until I was almost 8 years old. And it wasn't important for my mom, and it wasn't important for my dad because he had experienced residential school for 3 years. So it became something that was taboo for anyone who was being raised to understand their culture.
Do you feel that there is a resurgence of culture coming back since the ban was lifted?
I think so. I think that it happened in the 50s to a certain degree, but I think that's 2 generations ago. 3 generations ago, really. And you kind of go, all of a sudden they hear their, little bits and pieces of their history, and they, people who missed out in their great-grandparents practicing the culture and practicing traditions, the resurgence is trying to find out, what rights they had, what different things, culturally and also socially. And I really think that our people really missed out by assimilation so much that they really had a difficult time in trying to get it back, because so much of the history was buried with their ancestors, with their grandparents, their great-grandparents, and the choices that they had made during that time.
What is the biggest difference that you see before the ban and after? And how can we heal through all the lateral violence today?
I think that the thoughts of when the ban was in, I was just 5 when it was lifted. So it really never affected me as much as it affected other people. 67 years of having that ban affected many generations and families to not be involved because of fear of incarceration or being labeled. And I think that our people, all of a sudden, when the ban was lifted, were hard to wake up to the fact that there was a culture and was traditions and was a history that was very evident before the ban. And they're slowly awoken to the fact that they had rights within those laws of the big house or the peoples at the time. So I really think that it's been very difficult for a lot of people to find out their own history, their ancestry, their ties to a house, a namima. And every village is different. We're not all the same. Every family does different things, different ways. There's a general rule for our potlatches and for our feasts and different things, but there's things that are privileged by certain families, and that's just the way it was in the old days. You know, not everybody was a chief. And being a chief, at that time, I remember my dad, I said, "What's it like to be a chief?" And he said, "It just means I have more things I have to do for people around me." And he said, "It doesn't come." He said, "I don't ever say I'm Chief Andy Frank. I'm just Andy Frank. That's what I was born." And he said, "Other people will know that I'm a chief by how I treat them, how I respect them, how I feel about my culture and my traditions. They'll know who I am without me even telling them." So humbleness was a primary thing, and I think that it's recognized through our, through our laws. Michael. The humbleness of my father was very evident. And I think that a lot of people have told me, we remember your dad because of his humbleness and his quiet, his very low voice. He never yelled. He never yelled unless somebody was in danger. My father would, and I'd ask my dad, "Why can't you talk louder?" You know, when we had, he was talking in front of other people. And he said, "If I talk louder, somebody else is going to try to beat that." He said, "If I whisper and I speak normally to the people, then they will listen because they have to really try hard and people stay quiet." And that was one of the things that kept me in awe of my father. He would always just be in this beautiful, normal voice without yelling and screaming around, and never saying boastful things. And yet he grew up here in Comox and had been sent to, or taken to, residential school for 3 years. And then my feisty granny went, after the death of his father, went and demanded him to go home to help with the family needs. And apparently she was under 5 foot tall, and she went in and she just took him home. So when we talk about strong women, we all have that strong woman within our families. And, and that's one of the things that I realized, that those bans that we had against our culture were meaningless because of a woman who was 5'10", 5'11", or 4'10", 4'11", could come in into a residential school and demand her son back. That the power of understanding and that she had, that she needed her son home, and that was my dad.
If you could, what would you share with your parents and your grandparents about the ban and life since the ban?
Thank you. Gratefulness for hanging in there and teaching me and entrusting me. Having my mom only speaking Kwantlen, it made a whole different life for me. In that many things she said in our language, I understood in Kwantlen, but to translate it then, I had no other language to translate it to, and I appreciate that. I appreciate the entrustment that my parents had, giving me some of the history and giving me the precious responsibilities that they held. And I hope and pray that I've been able to pass it on to my children and my grandchildren, because otherwise it leaves and it's gone, and it's hard to retrieve. And that's the big problem with having this ban on our ways of life, is trying to get it back, trying to find our place in life. And I appreciate my parents for what they did for me and my family, and understanding that they went through hard times. I remember my mom talking about being in Alert Bay in 1920. And she talked about the big barge, and she said it was just like a mountain of all the artifacts just thrown on that barge. They weren't put in containers. She said it was just like a big mountain. And she remembers an old man. He came down to the wharf and he walked down onto the barge. He had his rings on. He was a hamatza. He danced around the things on the barge 4 times. Took his rings off and threw it on there and cried all the way back up. You know, the pain of separation from knowing who you are, your rights that you have, is so harsh for our old people that have witnessed this. My mom would cry. I'm crying now, but you know, it really affected me in her telling me how important that was for our people. This was part of who he was. He was a hamatza. And the things that represented our culture was on this barge, going to leave. And it was gathered and sacrificed by not being put into prison, by not being arrested. And it was easier for them in public to let it go, but in the meantime, in private, it tore them apart. That's what the laws at the time, the Potlatch laws at the time, had really done for our people. And it was a hurt that lives today, because it's a generational hurt. And the thing is, it hurts in ways that people have forgotten what rights they have in the big house, what rights they have in the community, what responsibilities they have for their families and to the community, and as a tribe as a whole. And I think that was the hardest thing for me to face, was seeing people wanting to know so bad, but there was nothing for them to gather because it had already gone. And all they could do was go to other people in the village and ask, what was this like? What did we have rights to? And so many of our people died in 1918 with the terrible influenza that went around. I mean, they buried whole families in the villages. And I remember Mom saying, you know, if it wasn't the laws, the illnesses took so many of our people, because we had nothing to fight it with, except USA. She said, you would never believe how many people would USA all the time, because that was our soul food that helped us get through. So, you know, it's something that hurts, that it had to happen that way, but we can't change history, and all we can do is try to pull back and pull together all the things that were taken away. And it takes every person who is culturally, traditionally minded to do that, because there's generations to come. They're going to want to know, what did you do to help bring back some of the stuff? And I never want any of my descendants to say, well, what did you do, great-granny, great-great-granny? What did you do? I never want that to happen. Thank you.
What do you hope that visitors will gain from visiting the exhibit?
See beyond the art. See the understanding of our people on what we've come through, what we've been able to survive. There's little pockets of people who are very, very culturally knowledgeable, and those people have a big responsibility, not only to their own family, but everybody around them that comes to them for a question that they have about their family and the ties that we have. We are all tied together with this common thread. It's our culture, it's our skin color, it's our dances, it's our songs, it's the big house. The Kwakwaka'wakw area peoples have really have a very rich culture that is unique in that we always work together as families, supporting each other, acknowledging our relatives because of previous years of their parents, their grandparents, great-grandparents being together and helping each other then. It's something we carry on. It's a tradition, it's a responsibility, and it's something that is the onus of every one of us as First Nations people here within our families. And I hope that that is something that my children and my grandchildren and great-grandchildren realize. And the only way they're going to learn is not just me telling them, but me doing what I say. And I think that that's a shortfall that a lot of our families have gone through. They tell you in school, they tell you at the elders' gatherings what you should do, but until your parents or grandparents show you, it just becomes more words, and it doesn't hit you where it should in your soul.
Thank you for your sharing today.
You're welcome.